Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to get started here just in about 2 minutes. We'd like to give everyone a chance to finish up their meeting that probably ended at the top of the hour and give them a chance to join and get into this GoToWebinar session, and we'll get started. And we're eager to start this conversation. So again, it's right here at the top of the hour. We'll get started at 2 past the hour. So thank you very much for joining us. A couple of logistics items before we get started. This is, as you heard the GoToWebinar robot say, this is being recorded. So those who couldn't join us live will be able to listen to the recording. We also, everyone is in listen mode except for the 4 of us, as well as Nicole, who is behind the scenes helping us with logistics. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any issues with the technology or anything like that, you can use the chat button. There's a chat window and you can chat to any of us. You can chat to the organizers and panelists. You can chat directly to Nicole, and we will try to help with any situations and obviously also answer any questions you may have. So we're just going to give it, now it's 1 past the hour, so we'll give it another minute. We're still seeing people stream into the webinar, getting into the system here. So give them another minute. We're actually just chatting as we were in the kind of the waiting area before we started this, that it's great to see. We're gonna have a lot of people on this webinar, that we have so many people that are willing to getting closer and closer to 2 years into this pandemic, that are willing to join us and be on webinars like this, that they aren't completely and utterly fatigued. Obviously, you see all 4 of us are very much in our homes. So hopefully, I think a lot of you probably are also in your homes. So happy to have you, invite you from your home into our homes to have this conversation. All right, so that is now 11:02. So I'm going to say a couple things again. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. You are here at the Are You Ready for ISO 31030? What you need to know about the new travel risk management global standard. This is a co-presentation of Global Secure Accreditation, Traxo, and International SOS. Just a couple of logistics items. Everyone's on listen mode. This is being recorded so we can share it with others that couldn't join us live. And we have Nicole as a 5th speaker who you might hear from. She is going to be working the chat window. So if you have any troubles with the technology, if you have any questions, you have any comments, anything you might want to interact with us because you're on listen mode, please go ahead and use that chat feature within GoToWebinar. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to go on to the next screen here. Next slide. So a couple of quick introductions. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Brian Butler. I am the Chief Sales Officer at Traxo. I am a 20-year corporate travel veteran, came up in the world through Hertz, spent a long time at Radius Travel and then at Upside Business Travel before joining here at Traxo. And I'm excited to introduce a couple other people here on our panel, our esteemed panel. Well, I'm not esteemed, but the rest of them are very esteemed. Andy Miller, Director of America's Partnerships at International SOS. Andy, will you introduce yourself?
Good. Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone again for taking the time for this webinar this afternoon or this morning and this evening. So again, my name is Andy Miller. I'm the head of partnerships for International SOS. So I lead all of our commercial partnerships within the Americas region. So Traxo and our travel partners, our insurance partners, and our broker partners. Again, I think this is a fantastic topic. We're hearing a lot about it in the market, so we're happy you're able to join today and get some more information.
Very good. Thank you, Andy. And next we have a buyer amongst us, but she is highly esteemed, a former BTN Travel Manager of the Year. Suzanne Boyan, will you introduce yourself to the group?
Sure. I'm Suzanne Boyan. I'm the Meetings and Travel Manager at ZS Associates. We are a consulting firm, a professional services firm located out of Evanston, Illinois, but we do have global locations. So everywhere except the Middle East, that is the one area where we do not have an office quite yet. So very much interested in this topic, but also how necessary it is for the future. And I don't know about that esteemed part, Brian, but thank you. That's very generous for a Tuesday morning.
you have my esteem. So if you have my esteem,
I'll take that.
You're esteemed from at least one person. So there you go. And I think Andy and Bob will agree with me. So, and last but not least, our fancy English professor for the day, Mr. Robert Quick, Bob Quick. Bob, will you introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you, Brian, and hello everyone. Welcome to the webinar. So my name is Bob Quick, and my background actually was 32 years in the British Police Service, where I specialised in dealing with serious organised crime and latterly countering terrorism. I was formerly a Chief Constable of a provincial police force south of London, and latterly Assistant Commissioner at New Scotland Yard in charge of specialist operations. So in that role, I had responsibility for the whole of United Kingdom for countering terrorism for the police service, protection of the royal family, wherever the British royal family went in the world, the Prime Minister and Cabinet ministers, the whole diplomatic community in the US, all the ambassadors that were in the embassies across the country and across the capital, and visiting heads of state, aviation, security, and lots of other things. So I guess what I'm saying is I spent 30 plus years in policing, dealing with a whole myriad of security related issues. In 2015, I started taking an interest in travel related risks. And because of my time in counter-terrorism, I experienced a lot of events around the world where the British Police Service worked in support of other police organisations dealing with terrorist attacks on travellers, actually, in hotels around the world, for example, where they were targeted by terror groups. So it got me thinking about travel-related security. So that's essentially my background. And ever since that time, I've been working in my company, GSA, on all aspects of travel risk management. And I was co-opted by the British Standards Institution to start work on ISO 31030. And I remained on the working group as a subject matter expert throughout the development of the standard. So today, what I want to do is run through that standard with Suzanne and Andrew's help to sort of draw out what the main issues are and things that I think people in the travel industry need to be thinking about, particularly travel managers.
Awesome. That, Bob, I mean, for all of you in the audience, if those credentials don't work for you, then go ahead and log off and ignore the recordings, things like that. But at least for me, you say Scotland Yard and counterterrorism, and then being on the working group for ISO 31030, I don't know anyone who would be more qualified to take us through an overview of ISO 31030. So without further ado, Bob, Professor Quick, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. I'll try and live up to that great introduction. So I think the first key message about this standard is it's a really important moment in time, I think, for the travel industry, because this is truly the world's first global benchmark for travel risk management standards. It gives us all something to aim for. Some of us might already be there, but many of us won't be. But it gives us a benchmark to aim for and compare and contrast our current practices and arrangements against. And it's a standard we can all coalesce around. So if we move to the next slide, I'll just introduce ISO for those of you that are less familiar. It is the world's preeminent standards organization. It's affiliated to United Nations. It works very closely with the Economic Council in the UN. It was founded in 1947. It's completely independent. The credentials on the screen really speak for themselves, but it's actually a huge endeavor, 50,000 plus experts. This standard, ISO 31030, has been subject of support from very many countries around the world. The most active countries probably were the USA, United Kingdom, Australia, France, Sweden, and many others besides. But about 166 countries have had some involvement in one form or another in the development of this standard. So it comes with great authority and legitimacy. So we go to the next slide. So why did this standard come into being? Well, really it was actually a British initiative by our national standards body here in the UK, and that's called the British Standards Institution. That's been around for a very, very long time, and is actually a global brand in its own right. And it proposed to ISO that a standard for travel risk management should be developed. And the reason that it did so was because, like many of us, it was tracking survey data around the world from the mid-2010s, about 2015 onwards, that was showing a lot of anxiety out there about travel risks on the part of travellers, whether they were business or leisure travellers, actually, but particularly corporate travel managers, who of course have a duty of care to their travellers, and they were reporting regularly that they saw the risks out there intensifying, becoming ever more complex and more difficult to predict, and therefore more difficult to manage. There was, of course, increased media reporting of incidents around the world. We've all seen pretty catastrophic incidents over the last 10 years or so, where sadly travellers have been on the receiving end of either criminal attacks, terror attacks, or major incidents or accidents, and all sorts of environmental hazards. So it's become very visible to us all. And of course, that duty of care is a big obligation on all of our shoulders to work together to make travel safer. And there was a recognition that, you know, we're all kind of making it up as we go along a little bit, and we could all do with some really well-developed guidance that's been the subject of international expertise, you know, to make sure that we're all doing the right thing and we can build on that practice going forward. Over to you, Brian.
Very good. So we thought we would interject a few polls into this just to get some feedback from all of you. So what you should see popping up now is a polling question, I hope. There we go. A polling question. So what issues do you think will most affect traveler confidence as we see corporate travel return? Obviously, different countries are returning at different speeds, different even parts of different countries are returning. What do you think will most affect traveler confidence? One, the ongoing risk from COVID-19, the risk of natural hazards like floods, earthquakes, forest fires, security threats like crime and terrorism, geopolitical risks, or the levels of support for travelers. So we'll give everyone a chance to answer that. So it's been pulled down, and Nicole is going to share some of the responses from that poll, or at least he's published those results. All right, there we go. So now it's up on the screen. You can see that COVID-19 by far the biggest response at 68%. Obviously, it's near and dear right now. It's what we've been dealing with for the past almost 20 months. So it's very clear. These other risks are definitely risks or things that we need to worry about, but it is going to be first and foremost on a lot of people's minds as they return. Is going to be COVID-19 is going to be right in front of them, literally as with masks on their face, going to be very much in front of them. Very good. Thank you. All right, Bob, over to you.
Okay, if we go to the next slide, it just gives an indication of some of those surveys that we've tracked in recent years, and you can see it expressed in various forms here, with 64% of security professionals saying they believe the risk-facing travellers had increased. That was back in 27. And these are trends which I'm sure Andy and Suzanne will probably recognise and have seen remain pretty consistent over the last few years. In fact, we'll go to some more recent data on the next slide. So here's a good example. This is the Institute of Travel Management survey taken last year at the beginning of 2020. And it really showed for the first time that traveller safety was the top priority of the organisation surveyed. And we've seen this reflected in other surveys by industry bodies. So this is really becoming an established trend now, and I think is a response to that recognition of the complexity of safeguarding our travellers in the modern world. And of course, COVID-19, as we saw in our poll there remains a great source of anxiety as we start to think about returning to travel. So if we go to the next slide, and perhaps I could bring Andy in here, but International SOS are a great source of data in terms of travel risk. And perhaps Andy, you could just talk us through some of the issues here.
Yeah, Bob, thanks for that. And I noticed a couple of times so far, just in the 10 minutes we've been talking, the word anxiety is coming up a lot, that travelers are really anxious to get out there. And Bob, the survey you mentioned on the first slide, it was 2015 to 2020, really pre-COVID. So what we're seeing, again, coming out of COVID and as our clients begin to return to travel, that anxiety level is higher than it ever has been. And again, companies and their employees are really looking to their organization to be able to provide, what are you doing for me to help me get back out on the road? And I think as we talk through the new standard, this is really a great framework to help shape that. So what we wanted to share here, again, I won't go through each one of these statistics. You can see them on the screen, but the point is this stuff is real, right? This is actual real data from our 10,000 plus clients of why are itineraries being modified. And this really was almost pre-COVID. It's security, it's civil unrest, it's geopolitical, it's national disasters. And I think it's really interesting from that last poll question, right? So 68% of our respondents said that COVID is really the number one thing on their minds and why travel might be disrupted, which yes, COVID is in the news every single day. The reality is one thing I definitely want you to take away from this webinar is don't just have COVID blinders, right? So all of these other risks are still out there. Your employees are still going to be looking at security threats. There's still going to be natural disasters. They're still just going to get sick. Right? 1 out of 2 travelers in a given year will have some sort of medical issue that requires at least them to call in for assistance or to think, what do I need to do in this foreign location? So again, as we go through this and you're thinking, why now? Why is this standard coming out now? How is this relevant to me? The reality is because this stuff is real, it's actually happening. And again, there are a lot of great tools within the standard that Bob will go through here in a few minutes to help us really frame what that looks like.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you very much.
All right,
so Brian,
time for our next poll here. So this is a question about your organization. How engaged are your internal stakeholders in your TRM function, your travel risk management function? Is it ranging on the spectrum, right? Full engagement with the relevant internal stakeholders, partial engagement with the most relevant stakeholders, partial engagement with a few relevant stakeholders, or little engagement with relevant stakeholders. My apologies for the grammatical mistake there. It's not a possessive stakeholders, it's plural stakeholders, so my apologies there, oversight. Let's give everyone a chance to answer this one, and then Nicole will publish the results for us. Curious where the audience is in terms of this that engagement level within their organization when it comes to travel risk management. So I think the results are going to pop up here momentarily. There we go. So quite the range. So very few that are at the little engagement, but nice. The highest level, 38% at full engagement, and very closely behind partial engagement with most relevant stakeholders. So you take those top 2 in terms of engagement, you're over 70% of the respondents of people here on this webinar are having some pretty positive level of engagement with internal stakeholders when it comes to travel risk management. I would assume that has a lot to do with COVID, and it's probably heightened if we ask the question of is it more or less than it was pre-pandemic. I'm guessing it for most people will be more. So very good. Thank you very much for that, Nicole. All right, Bob, back over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, that was really encouraging, actually, the results of that poll, because certainly if you read ISO 31030, you will see one of the overriding messages is really about integrating your travel risk management function and your program with the other parts of your organization that can add value. So your risk management teams, your security teams, your HR department, your occupational health, your travel management team, of course, your legal department, procurement, IT security, don't forget the cyber threat for travelers, very important. And of course, your travel management company partner, if you're using an agent or a TMC, then they're going to be absolutely critical for you getting this right and aligning carefully and directly with this standard. And of course, your supply chain more generally will all have a contribution to make, but engagement with your internal stakeholders is really your first step, and drawing them in so that they really do participate and add that value to what you're trying to achieve in your travel risk management program. The standard itself has recently been released by ISO, so it is available. It will be subject of a major launch by the BSI, the sponsoring organisation in the UK, and other standards bodies around the world will also be publicising it as we go forward. So the American equivalent of that will probably be publishing ISO 31030 in the near future. But you can see some of the headings there that the guidance is steering you towards around aligning your travel risk management with your business continuity activities, your risk management procedures or frameworks. Many organisations will already be familiar with ISO 31000, which is a very well established and the world's preeminent risk management practice framework. So actually this is designed to dovetail into that very well, and you'll recognise the same language and the same general framework. We go to the next slide, Brian, please. So of course the guidance puts great emphasis on the duty of care, that moral and legal obligation that we all have to safeguard our travellers. But I think an important thing to say about this standard is it's written in such a way as to be adaptable, because organisations vary enormously in the objectives of their travel programs and their risk tolerance. Clearly, an oil exploration company traveling all over the world and very hazardous parts of the world will have a very different set of requirements perhaps to a photocopy repair company that's just sending employees out on national travel in relatively safe locations. So it's really designed to be interpreted flexibly in context of your travel risk management program and your travel objectives. If we go to the next slide, Brian.
Okay, so another poll for you, another question for everyone. This is similar to the last one, but it's sort of the next level of detail. How engaged is your organization with its supply chain in addressing travel safety, security, and health risks? So in terms of those then outside your organization, but are obviously related to what you're doing in terms of whether it's supply, whether it's other things that you've procured, other organizations, third parties that you work with to make all these things happen within your organization. How engaged are you with it? Are you with them? Fully engaged, partially engaged, little engagement, or you delegate it to your TMC partner, especially when it comes to the travel side of things? Give everyone a chance to answer this one, and then Nicole will publish the results for us. Gotta say, it's a pretty handy tool, these polls, and how quickly it brings us back the results. So here we go, popped up. Yeah, so again, similar to the last one. So not only we have really good engagement within this webinar audience on engagement inside the organization, we have some really good engagement in terms of the third parties that you work with as well, your supply chain. So 39% are fully engaged and 42% are partially engaged. So we put those two together, we're at 80%, more than 80% of the audience that is fully or partially engaged with your supply chain. So obviously that's a major part of it, and Bob will go into a little bit more of that now.
Okay, again, quite encouraging results there, because again, this new standard is really promoting that organisations think carefully about their supply chain. Interesting, the TMC result there, because again, when you read the guidance, it's really emphasising the role of TMCs and the role they could play in helping organisations align with this guidance. I don't know, Suzanne, whether you've any comments you want to make about the role of TMCs.
I think they play a vital role. They're a big part of corporate travel management, right? And so that's where you're going to get the vast majority of your data. And if you're not sending your data to an international SOS or something like that, that's a lot of pressure to be putting onto the organization to handle the duty of care. Now, of course, I strongly believe, and I'm sure people have heard me say it before, that there are great reasons to book outside of your TMC, and that's where Traxo comes into play. And so there's something to be said about prioritizing getting the data and prioritizing risk management over control and pushing people towards a very managed travel program. So while I agree that travel management companies have a role, I would say tread carefully with outsourcing to travel management companies. They often do not have all of the data. And you could be putting your company and yourself at unnecessary risk.
Absolutely, good advice. So, as you can see from this slide, really, the guidance is creating this framework to guide you through a very structured, very systematic process, and it will get you to ask yourself lots of questions about your current program and your current requirements, and how to introduce risk assessment into every aspect of your travel program. And we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail after the next poll. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, so actually I'm going to put this up there and I'm going to go right back to this slide. So this is going to be, the poll question is going to be, to what extent does your travel risk management cover these areas, the areas we just went through, of travel risk from the previous slide? Does it cover most of these areas? Does it cover more than this? Does it cover some of them? Does it cover none? So I'll go back and I'll put that on the screen. Actually, I don't know if you can actually see it, so I'll just, you'll have to remember what we just went through. Do you feel like you are in a place, your organization is a place where you're doing most of these things, you're doing some of them, you're really doing none of them, or you're doing even more than what is listed on this that Bob just went through? Okay, we'll see the results come back up here. Drum roll, here it comes. All right, that's great. That's really impressive. So 52% of the audience feels that they cover most of these areas, that they're pretty well covered in terms of their travel risk management practices today, that they're going to hit on most of what the ISO 31030 standard is saying to do. And then another 18% on top of that do even more. So we've got 70% of the audience that has that, and then everyone else has at least some, right? There's only 1% of the audience that really feels like they just don't have any of this in place and are starting from scratch. So that's good news, Bob.
Again, that's very encouraging, Brian. What I would say to the audience is hold that thought, because I'll come to a slide in a moment where you might want to ask yourself the same question, but it does seem to me that many of the representatives on this webinar are engaged in a managed program that has some logic and structure and system to it, which is really important and will bring you very close to aligning with this guidance. And I'm sure whatever organization you are, there'll always be something you can learn from this to improve your current practice and processes. But I think I'll make this really important point is unfortunately, as we all know, sometimes things can go wrong in travel, and very occasionally they can have very serious consequences. And I think it's important to bear in the back of your mind now that over and above all the obligations we already have, whether they're moral or legal, the fact that this guidance has now been published and given the authority that it has, any claimant who brings an action against your organization for negligence or whatever is likely to cite this guidance as a reasonable test of your organization's due diligence in taking care of your travelers. So I think that's an important thing to have in the back of your mind. Now, we asked lawyers in the UK to comment on this, a leading London law firm that operate in the litigation space, particularly in the world of travel. and this was their advice, as you can see. Now, this applies to England and Wales, but of course other jurisdictions may have a similar landscape, and there may be similar potential consequences for not taking this standard seriously. So my message is very simple. Do take this seriously. It has authority. It has huge credentials, given the expertise from all over the world that have contributed to it. Much of it you'll recognise as professionals, but hopefully there'll be new things in there that will help you. But I thought it'd be useful to just see that advice. If we go to the next slide. So this is a really interesting slide for me, because really it demonstrates the scope of this standard. And when you were answering that earlier poll about how much of the standard you cover, I wonder whether it embraces all of these subject areas, because this is an end-to-end standard and guidance. And it really starts with your planning and your policies and your procedures, but it also deals with things like traveller assessment. Is your traveller capable to safely undertake the travel that you're asking of them? Have they got sufficient experience? Have they got the knowledge and wisdom to navigate the hazards that you could reasonably foresee on this business trip? Have they got the right authorizations in place? Do your policies require those authorizations? There was a case in the United Kingdom recently, a tragic one actually, where the traveller was killed in a helicopter crash, very sadly, in South America. He was an employee of a British firm, and the family made a claim against the employers. And the claim was based on the fact that they did not have a policy in place to authorise that flight. The employee was due to travel on a different mode of transport. That became unavailable, and at the last minute he was offered a flight on a helicopter. But no formal process existed for that to be authorised and properly considered by the employer. Was that a safe mode of transport? Is this a reliable, reputable company? So things like that can really catch organisations out. So the traveller assessment also goes to things like fitness. Is your traveller fit and well to undertake this journey, not just competent? Journey and transport modes, destinations are really important. Do you really understand this destination and what hazards and threats may be lurking behind the scenes? And of course, there are sources of expertise and information out there that, like ISOS, that can help you. Accommodation is another big area of the guidance. The guidance is really telling us not to simply assume hotels that you've used in the past are safe. They may not be. If you really know them well and you're really familiar with their security standards, all well and good. But the standard places an obligation to assess accommodation and not simply allow the hotel or the other accommodation provider to mark their own homework and tell you that they're safe and secure, because clearly they want to win your business. So that is not necessarily a reliable mechanism to gain assurance of safety and security standards. Health risks, medical support in the destination. Are you familiar with what medical facilities are available? What's the public health landscape like on the ground there? What's the position with infectious diseases, regional viruses like MERS, SARS and others? These are all things that COVID-19 have really impressed upon us, are quite important to us all. And the last one I'd mention there is bleisure, which is another one that can catch companies out. This mixture between business travel and where the employee might choose to undertake some leisure time out on the business trip. And I recall my colleague actually here in Global Secure in a previous life, he had an employee in Istanbul on a business trip, and the employee telephoned him one day simply to say, I'm trapped on the Bosphorus Bridge and I've got battle tanks in front of me and I've got battle tanks behind me facing each other off on the bridge, and I'm stuck in a taxi cab and I can't move. And that, if that wasn't bad enough, he then said, oh, and by the way, I brought my 12-year-old daughter with me on the trip, and she's alone in the hotel. And of course, the organisation didn't have any procedures or policies to deal with that eventuality. And they were completely unaware that this young lady was with her father on this business trip. So, you know, these are all important considerations that the standard will direct you to if you haven't covered this ground already. So it's worth asking yourself, you know, do your current arrangements cover all those topics? The traveller assessment really speaks for itself, but it's appropriate checks. It's proportionate to the location and type of activities you're going to be asking your traveller to do. But having basic assurance that they're medically fit and they've got the skill sets to undertake the travel, and post-travel checks can be very important as well, and they're recommended, particularly for long distance travel or high stress trips where you want to check your travellers okay when they get back, and of course debrief your traveller about any incidents that may have occurred, because that's a great opportunity to learn where things might have gone wrong or nearly went wrong, and you can learn from that. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So of course, we've spoken about COVID-19. So the guidance asks organisations to proactively assess not just security threats, but safety threats like the risk from floods, from forest fires, from other natural hazards, from poor infrastructure, poor safety standards, things like that that you really need to be cognizant of, but also health standards. You know, what are the hygiene standards, food safety standards at that location, at that hotel? And what's the case with regional viruses and the response to COVID-19? Are there infection control protocols up to standard, and do they meet your requirements? So you can really see it's a comprehensive assessment that you're being asked to undertake in proportion to the type of journeys. But it really requires you to think of each journey as a project, really. Okay.
And what I will chime in on this is that this is a lot for anyone to take on by themselves, right? This is, if Suze is trying to do this as a travel manager, or if there's someone in an organization that's a risk manager that's taking this on, okay, so every trip that has going, not only do you have to have the data and you have to know where they're going, then you have to do all of this assessment on every single place that they're going. You have to have that intel, you have to have all that information, you have to be able to then decipher what's what. And that's why it's, you know, that's why there's companies like International SOS. So maybe Andy, maybe you can chime in on just giving everyone a little overview of what International SOS does around the areas in this slide specifically.
Yeah, I think, Brian, you make a great point. If you look at just the evolution of the travel risk space over the past 20 years, really, after September 11th, everybody was focused super heavily on security, right? Everyone was concerned about terrorism. Everyone was concerned about access controls, and really security was at the forefront. What we've seen is almost a 180-degree shift over the past year and a half or so, where now the focus for most corporations is on medical and on that medical support and the ability for not only your employees to be able to call and talk to a medical professional during an actual live issue, but that preparation piece of it. And really, if you see there, the first one, the requirement to risk assess public health issues in medical facilities. That's kind of the core of what International SOS does, and the core of our business is evaluating medical facilities and making sure that our clients have access to those facilities. And I'll say one of the things that I've really noticed over the past year or so now is medical facilities where pre-COVID we would have said, yep, they're great. Now there are so many additional things you need to evaluate, including what's the ICU capacity, what are the vaccination rates around that hospital, what are the potentials for that hospital to be full. So you might not have COVID, but you might be in an accident, you might break your ankle, or you might be in a car accident, or you might have a heart attack, and you need to go to that hospital. Well, if that ER is completely at capacity with COVID patients because of low vaccination rates, for example, then that's something you need to be prepared for before you go on that trip. And maybe that's a reason why your company may say, hey, maybe you shouldn't go on this trip because there's not adequate medical capacity in that given location. So again, having a partner there like International SOS or really just an organization that can give you reliable information and access to that information for both the manager as well as your employees really is a non-negotiable, I think, coming out of the pandemic.
Suze, would you like to kind of chime in on this? I mean, obviously you are a client of International SOS, so you obviously are bought into this concept. But can you imagine trying to do these things without a partner?
No, absolutely not. I mean, not with a global organization as big as CS, right? I mean, if you're a smaller organization, I could maybe understand trying to do this by yourself. I think it would be a lot of pressure on a singular person. But then it's more about picking and choosing your battles and deciding where you want to put your apples into, right? What basket. For me, though, I always say I don't want to think too hard about duty of care. I want to put the right policies in place. I want to do all the upfront things that are necessary, and then I pass it off to International SOS to take it from there. Because to think about on a good day, the 1,000 people we have in the air and where they're going and every little thing, that's not what the core of my job is, in my opinion. You know, that's the core of what International SOS does. So.
Yeah, so it's your Ron Popeil, set it and forget it, right? You want to be able to put it in place, and then because otherwise, if you've got those 1,000 souls that you have some level of responsibility for, and you're not gonna be able to sleep, right? Yeah, that's really what it all comes down to. In all of our lives, it's just making sure that we have things set up in our lives so we can sleep at night. So
yeah,
if we're not doing that, everything else falls apart. Very good. All right, back to you, Bob.
Okay, so here's another area, booking procedures. The guidance will talk about leakage from your program, where people are booking travel that you're not aware of. And that obviously introduces a lot of risk, and you can't escape that risk because in most jurisdictions, the organization will be to some extent held to account for that and ask, well, what did you do to stop that happening? So one of the things the guidance says is talking about making sure your planned travel is recorded, it's visible to your TRM function, is properly assessed and approved in line with your policy. So, that's a really high risk area. I've spoken to so many travel managers that say this is a perennial headache for them. So, it's something to look at very closely and carefully. And having the right arrangements in place can really help you when there is an incident. It can give you access to data to respond to a travel-related incident much more effectively and much quicker. So an important thing to consider is some kind of mandatory booking process where people are directed into approved channels.
And and we all know, right? Any of us who have been in the industry, we know that you can have a travel program that mandates you must use the TMC, you must book through these different sources. Those are the on-channel booking, those are the approved booking channels. You have to book there. But we also all know that travelers are going to do what travelers are going to do. Now, maybe somewhat over the last 18 months, the travel that you've had, because it's maybe been limited, you've been able to get your hands or arms around that. You've been able to put really strict pre-trip approvals in place. Those are going to be really hard when you're not at 5% of your travel spend for 2019, you're at 60% of your travel spend for 2019. That's going to be really hard to be able to scale. Those are going to break. And you are going to have people that book outside of your program. That always happens. I mean, we know that for the history of teams of travel management, 50% of all hotel bookings are always booked outside of the TMC. It's the way it works. There's a lot of the airlines being booked out of it, as well as a huge number for rail, for car rentals, all these different pieces that you need to have that visibility. And that's what the standard really makes clear is either you have to ensure that everyone books through the mandatory channel, or you have to have some way of accessing that data. And that's where Traxo comes into play. And that's what we do is ensuring that there's a way to automatically capture all of that off-channel booking data and be able to send it downstream to places like International SOS. So you're getting that coverage and also have that visibility for your company.
Absolutely, Brian. Thank you. Next slides. So this schematic is really just showing you the scope of the risk treatment options that the guidance talk about. I won't rehearse it all, but you can see some of the headings on the slide there. So it's very extensive. I think that's all I need to say. If we move to the next slide, conscious we want to move to some questions. Accommodation I've mentioned before. When things go wrong on travel, it can often be linked to a poor choice of accommodation. So the guidance is really saying it needs to be risk assessed objectively. The old practice of just putting some security questions in an RFP for the hotel to respond to is not really seen as credible. So it can be dealt with by evidence-based questionnaires in low-risk properties, or formal accreditation for anything from low risk to high risk. It can also be for high risk properties, you'll look for an accreditation system that's really independently verified and has got the credentials you want, i.e. there are experts doing it and it's got some kind of oversight that gives you confidence that this is a proper assessment. So you need to do your due diligence. You'll see from the paragraph there, the guidance is saying you shouldn't really be using the term preferred or approved accommodation or program unless there's been some element of health, safety and security risk assessment involved. So on that note, we can move to the next slide, and perhaps I'll hand over to Suzanne and Andrew really to talk about some of the benefits of adopting this guidance fully.
So Bob, I can hop in here first. I think you can see some of the main benefits on the screen here, but I think when you're looking at this and we're thinking, why now? Why did ISO decide to take this up now? Again, we've given you a lot of great background information from what's included in the standard and what that really means to you. So when you're presenting this to your management teams, and what we're seeing is more and more C-level executives are asking these questions on what are we doing around travel risk, questions that they were not bugging you with 2 years ago, they're going to bug you with now. Right? So what is in it for the organization? Why should you care about this? And also, in addition to the items you see on the screen, a couple that we see from our clients that really stick out. One, retention of employees and recruiting for employees. We read in the news all the time that every job is looking for people that are qualified to work for that company. There's a huge competitive situation, especially for companies that are really in the industries where they do have international travel, and travel can be a main benefit for these organizations. But those employees and those candidates are going to say, how are you going to keep me safe? How are you going to make sure that when I am on that business trip for you, that I am taken care of and I am prepared for that trip? So that's a huge piece of it. The other thing that I see, especially where I sit within International SOS, managing our relationships with the insurance industry, insurers love decreased risk. So if you can demonstrate for your insurance carriers that we have these processes in place, we have all of these standards that we're meeting, that's going to ultimately result in you reducing your claims, which ultimately will reduce your premiums. And again, your risk management teams and your broker and your insurance carriers, they love seeing that you have pieces of this that will reduce your risk. And then just the last thing that I'll mention, and from International SOS's perspective, not all of our clients have stopped traveling, right? So we have clients really in every industry and every sector across the world. And really why they use us and why these standards are important is because at the core of this, we help you enable your business, right? We're all in the business of helping our business do what they do, whether that's mining, whether that's education, whether that's consulting, whatever that is. The reason that all of us in this webinar is to ultimately support that person when they go out on the road. So when we're thinking about this and why we're doing this and why this matters, at the end of the day, think about why are your employees traveling. It's to make a big sale. It's to close a deal. It's to meet a prospect. It's to meet face to face. So all of those things are not possible, especially coming out of COVID, without these standards, without you addressing these. So Suze, wanted to hand it over to you as well here. And you're actually living this, you're seeing it every single day. And it is what we're talking about from Brian, Bob, and myself on the supplier side, is that actually the real world, what you're seeing with your employees?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we go through this, it's easy to kind of put your guard up and say, well, there's just too much risk. We're never going to travel again. And that I don't think that's the intent of this at all, right? Yeah, cover your eyes, cover your ears. That's not the intent of this at all. There's risk with everything. There's risk just living your life. There's always been risk in travel, both health and safety wise. It's just that there is absolutely more eyes on it now since COVID. And so it's about really, again, setting your program up for success, putting all of those assurances in place so that way you don't have to think about it. But that's, what I love about this standard is, to me, duty of care was always a bit nebulous, if that's the right word. For when I would talk about it with our legal team and our HR team, and we would talk about it, they would say, well, duty of care is, they would compare you to organizations that are like you and see if you provided similar care. Well, now we have a real standard that we can say, okay, at least we've checked this off, right? So I don't have to go around to other consulting firms that might not want to share what they're doing during a crisis of some sort. Okay, I feel confident that I've done everything that I could have done in my power to mitigate the risk to ZS, mitigate the risk to our travelers. So that's what this is about. We've been traveling all throughout the pandemic. We started really opening up travel in the last month, both domestically and international. And again, just going in with our eyes wide open, but also making our employees' eyes wide open too, saying this is what you're walking into. Don't expect it to be a pre-pandemic world out there. It's not.
Very good. And ultimately, right, it's the ability for you, for the risk management function, and for the travelers to all be able to sleep at night, and their families to be able to sleep at night. Just all of us feeling like we've taken these different steps to ensure that, that safety and security as much as we can within reason, right? We can't wrap everyone in bubble wrap and walk past them and hold their hands everywhere they go, but you can do what you can to ensure that you're taking those steps, and that's what this standard really does. Very good. So Bob, I'll let you kind of try to wrap, there's a couple slides here that sort of wrap up your view of, in the grand scheme of things, what ISO 31030 is really saying.
Absolutely, Brian. I think to sum up this standard, really, what it's saying is you need to substitute the assumption that things are safe, whether it's a destination, whether it's a hotel, whether it's a transportation mode. Substitute assumption for assessment. And it's really guiding you to put your foot on the ball, stop and think about each aspect of that journey. It may be a low risk journey, so the level of assessment doesn't need to be so sophisticated, but clearly some journeys to some parts of the world have to be pretty sophisticated, and you may need partners to help you. And that's the headline.
Excellent. So we're going to go right quickly into a handful of questions. We already have some that have come in. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll make sure that we answer as many as we can here. The first one, and I'll take a stab at this one first, Bob, and then you can chime in afterwards. The question was, can you talk more about the organization's travel risk criteria? Oh, I apologize. I missed it. They're coming in fast and furious. So I had one that was here. It says, does this standard override the GDPR requirements? So especially in Europe, we know we have GDPR, we have other requirements about data security and privacy in places like California and other parts of the world. Does it override that? I will answer this by saying no, it does not override that. It does not say that, okay, we don't have to worry about any of these things, you don't have to worry about GDPR because you have to make sure your people are covered. So when you're working with someone, like let's say from a data perspective, you're working with someone like Traxo, we are GDPR compliant. We are going to make sure that we are collecting data in a way that is still following GDPR rules, that still takes into mind the privacy of the traveler. So it is a balancing act though, right? It's going to be, you need to have the data, but then you also want to give your traveler the privacy that they really should have, and that things like GDPR give them. Bob, anything that you'd like to add on to that?
Well, I think you're spot on, Brian. It doesn't override these international legislations. You should be working with GDPR compliant partners. Your internal practices should be compliant. One of the most tricky areas, of course, about people's medical conditions. So you can set up internal voluntary disclosure schemes if you haven't got an internal occupational health, or you can turn to a partner that can do your screening for you, but it should all be GDPR compliant.
Very good. All right, next one. Bob, can you talk a little bit more about the organization's travel risk criteria being recorded in their travel risk management policy? Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, this really goes to the fact that organisations have different requirements. You know, they may have quite challenging travel requirements. So it really asks organisations to think carefully about, you know, what is their risk criteria? You know, what's their risk appetite? And really think carefully about these things and record it so that they have a conscious decision or set of decisions. They have a record, so their decision making can be referenced back to that. And of course, some travel, frankly, can't be justified and will not be within that travel risk criteria set within your policy framework. So again, the guidance gives quite a lot of detail on this and sets out the steps that organisations should follow.
All right, very good. Next one. Is there an actual scale that exists that asks pertinent questions and provides an overall risk score? Is there a, like a picture in my mind, like where's the survey questions and I fill out all these surveys and it spits out a risk score. Has anyone developed anything like that yet for ISO 31030?
There are tools available that can help you and guide you to make decisions, and risk management specialists can help you with that. Again, partners like International SOS can help with those things. If you haven't got the skills inside the business to make these assessments and make these judgments, again, the guidance is very clear that you should seriously consider getting external expertise to help you.
Very good. And just you're too modest to do this, but so GSA, your company, Global Secure Accreditation, can do some of these things, can work with companies if they are interested in doing an assessment of how what their current risk policies are and things like that, and what they have in place, can do some of those things to provide somewhat of a score, or at least feedback from a consulting perspective. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're actually training travel managers at the moment through GBTA, the Global Business Travel Association. We have a boot camp where we're really getting into all these issues in a practical detail, a practical level, and introducing tools to travel managers that help them and guide them in this assessment or these assessment processes, and also identifying the capabilities in the marketplace that they should be looking to where they haven't got these skills internally.
Very good. And the last one, at least we have for now, is there a difference between duty of care for domestic and for international travel?
I don't believe so. I think all the lawyers I've spoken to are very clear that the duty of care is the duty of care. What changes is your risk assessment processes. Clearly, if you're sending someone, in their own country on travel, where the environment will be quite familiar to them, you'll be very familiar with what the crime threats are and various other things, then that would reasonably be deemed as low risk if it's in a low risk country. Clearly, if you're sending a traveller to a country that's not got such well developed security systems, policing and justice systems, so crime threats are more severe, maybe terror risks are higher, maybe infrastructure is of poor quality, so you've got risks of accident and other hazards, then clearly the level of intrusiveness that you would be required to demonstrate would be higher in assessing those risks and guiding your traveller.
Very good.
And one really quick comment on that, Bob. So I will say that the number one request we've gotten from clients over the past year on their renewals of their International SOS program is to add domestic travel support. So again, pre-COVID, we really never were being requested to support a traveler domestically. And now a pretty high percentage of the calls we get in our assistance centers globally are around domestic support. So certainly something that you should be considering.
Excellent. Very good. Well, there we are, right a minute away from the top of the hour. Well done, Professor Quick. The class is almost dismissed. Well done. Thank you very much. I want to thank Bob Quick from GSA. I want to thank Suzanne Boyan from ZS Associates and Andy Miller from ISOS. I'm Brian Butler from Traxo. Again, we'll be following up with a post-event survey. Would love to hear from you. If you would like to hear from us, just let us know via that. Obviously, you could also reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. We are more than happy to hear from you, answer any other questions you may have, or discuss our product, especially for Traxo, GSA, and International SOS. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening or wherever it may be. And we look forward to talking to you all soon. Thank you.